So this is an example. We're going to be talking about the Gulf of Mexico, but this is a problem that we will see in many different embayments or bays across the world. And what this image is showing you is a satellite image of the coastline after a rainstorm. And what you can see here is all of this runoff has created sediments that are going into the water. And so water pollution is basically the addition of any of these harmful substances or things that can degrade water quality. Many substances qualify as pollutants, but you can think about the fact that raw sewage, industrial chemicals, all these different things can be dumped into water. And so water systems, rivers especially, are ways in which people have used, mechanisms by which people have used to move pollutants away from them for centuries and millennia. Basically, water moves things away from you, but users that live downstream are then exposed to different kinds of pollutants based on upstream activity. Stormwater runoff is another one, so water from precipitation that might flow on your roads. You might have seen, if you live near the coastline, signs or spray-painted signs on drains that say that this drains into the Sound or this drains into the ocean. That means that there's no treatment going on between what comes off the road, which might have residues from fossil fuels from cars, and it goes right into the nearby waterway. And then another one is thermal pollution. That's especially important when we think about industry. And so something like a nuclear power plant is bringing in cold water, using it to cool the fuel cells, and then it's being returned to the river. But the temperature of the water might be very different. That's very true also for a lot of industrial cooling. And so that's another form of pollution, even though it might not have different kinds of more contaminants. The temperature of the water is really important when we think about river and embayment health. So again, we have these point source and non-point sources when we talk about water pollution. Point source pollution is basically from discharge pipes that you can actually see, and some of the effluent can be very dangerous. Some of it can carry raw sewage, and some of it can carry pathogens. And then non-source point pollution is runoff that comes from overland flow, meaning runoff that occurs like when you have rain fall on an agricultural field that's loaded with nitrogen fertilizer, for example. And so those sediments can cloud the water and disrupt photosynthesis. So we talk about plankton, for example. Phytoplankton need photosynthesis. They carry out photosynthesis. They need light. Seagrass beds also need light. And so when you have these sediment loads being delivered into these coastal areas from storms that are full of that could be full of pollutants, it sort of changes the health of the system. And so here's just a diagram that shows the difference between point source and non-point sources in terms of the context of water pollution. And so what you see on the left is that you can actually identify the different pipes that are putting that pollutant into the water. And so, for example, if you go to the Middletown sewage treatment facility, you will see that there is a pipe that goes right into the Connecticut River and it bubbles up. And during times of high rainfall, the sewage treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, still has to process all of that water. And so what happens is that lower quality water gets put into the river because there's just simply not time to treat all of that water because there's so much water coming into the water treatment plant. So that is an example of how point source pollution can be a problem. Non-point sources are things like agricultural fields or even industrial pollution that from smokestacks that then gets deposited, remember the word deposition, onto land surfaces that then gets washed off into rivers. So here's an example on the left of non-point source pollution, and then here's an example on the right of point source pollution where we actually see the drain from which that water is coming. And so dissolved oxygen is really important when we think about water quality, and hypoxia is this situation where a body of water has oxygen that gets depleted, and I'm going to talk about how that happens, but that is a major source of water pollution across different bays in the world where they're receiving lots of runoff from land surfaces directly into coastal areas. And so here's a diagram on the left, sort of shows you that the water is clear, the crabs are happy, the clams are happy, the fish are happy, the plants are happy, right? And so, but what happens when you have sediment loading of nitrogen and phosphorus, principally from agricultural runoff and also sewage treatment plants, basically that causes sedimentation, which lowers the water clarity, but it also, that increase in nutrients causes nitrogen, of nitrogen and phosphorus causes algal blooms, and therefore that then blocks the amount of sunlight. Once those algal blooms die off, they go to the bottom, and decomposers start to munch up all that dead material, and that depletes the oxygen further. In this next slide, this actually shows kind of the progression of what happens in terms of eutrophication, right? Which is this process by which these excess nutrients in aquatic systems sort of feed this biological productivity, but then deplete the oxygen. So nitrogen and phosphorus run off, you get algal blooms, those algal blooms block sunlight, oxygen levels fall, as underwater photosynthesis declines, plants die, those algal blooms die and the plants die, and they go to the bottom of the bodies of water. These things increase turbidity or cloudiness, and then these dead plants eat up the bacteria. The bacterial decomposers eat up those dead plants and then drop the this is a real concern for U.S. waters and international waters alike. And so if we look at the case of the Gulf of Mexico, for example, there are these dead zones that occur in the summer. Likewise, in Long Island Sound, there are these dead zones that occur in Long Island Sound as you get closer, especially as you get closer to New York, because the East River, where there are several sewage treatment plants for the city of New York, are right at the mouth of the East River. And so that means there's an influx of nitrogen that occurs from the sewage treatment plant effluents. So sewage is rich in nitrogen, and that can cause hypoxia. And so we get these dead zones across many different bays across the world. The Gulf of Mexico and Long Island Sound are just two examples. And so this is an example of a study where people were trying to understand the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And in 1988, it was actually 40 square kilometers in size. And then over time, by 2002, the hypoxic zone was 22,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of Connecticut. And a lot of this wasn't having to do with oil rigs. It was actually because of influx of nitrogen and phosphorus into the Gulf of Mexico because of agricultural activity. And so if we look at the Mississippi River watershed, and a watershed is sort of defined as like if a drop of water falls onto a land surface, where will that water flow? And so if we look at this, if the water over here, if a drop of water fell from the sky here, it would flow in this direction. Whereas all of these river systems are part of the Mississippi watershed. And so look at the size of land area that's drained into the Gulf of Mexico by the Mississippi River. And so all of the nitrogen and phosphorus that runs off of these land surfaces, and you know that much of our agriculture occurs as well in this area, all of that nitrogen and phosphorus gets deposited here. And that's really the reason for these. So the Clean Water Act is the principal mechanism by which the U.S. regulates water quality. There are these performance standards. That's true for air pollution as well. So there are these allowable levels of pollutants that can be present. And so it sort of protects against public pathogens. And also, both of the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act have these citizen suit provisions where individuals and groups of individuals can sue companies under the Clean Water Act to try to mediate or regulate water. And so the goal of the Clean Water Act is really to try to make waters safe for fishing and swimming,